I Don't Fit In from Paul Collins on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Paul has been on this show many times, and as you know, he's the undisputed king of power pop. Fans can now get more inside Collins' own creative mind and his life through an upcoming book and album from his archives. I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat. Paul also has an upcoming album from his archives we're going to talk about too, Another World, the best of the archives. Welcome back to the show, Paul Collins.
Hello, Chris, and hello, everybody out there in Radio Land and the Revenge of the 80s. It's good to be here.
Good to have you back. Touring the world is a Paul Collins yearly tradition, but 2020 kind of put a damper on that.
Yes, I did have to cancel two and a half tours, which, like many other musicians and entertainers had to do. But, thank gosh, I managed to get out before they started. One tour was going to start in California right as the pandemic hit, and we were desperately, frantically trying to decide, should we go, should we couldn't show? And it was right at the cusp when nobody really knew how bad it was going to be. And in the end, we said, you know what? We don't want to get out there and find out that we made a terrible mistake. So we canceled. And thank gosh we did.
Paul, your fans know that you travel the world every year. You tour in many different countries. What they're going to know when they start reading the book is that you've been well-traveled all your life.
Yes, I started out as a kid. When I was 6.5 years old, my mom took my whole family from Douglaston, Long Island to Saigon, Vietnam. So that was my first big trip, and I guess I must have really liked it and got the travel bug from that, because ever since then I've kind of been a bit of a nomad traveling around the world, which is one of the wonderful things about playing music is you get to work and travel.
I should get back to this because you said you lived in Saigon, and I want to reiterate this. You were there when the Vietnam War was going on.
Yes, I was. We left in 1963, in June 1963, and that was just when it was starting to get really, really bad, and the government, the U.S. government or the U.S. Embassy, told all the civilians and people that were connected with the military that it was time for them to leave. My stepfather at the time was a civilian with the service. He was an engineer, and he was training Vietnamese men how to unload heavy-duty cargo ships. So we were all ordered to leave, and right after we left, it got very bad.
Good thing you left at the right time, but how did that and later living in more peaceful Greece afterwards shape your thinking and outlook on life in the future?
Well, as anyone will know, the minute they pick up that book, in the very first sentence or the prologue, I was living in Greece, and that's when one day I was standing there as a little kid in my neighbor's backyard, and his older sister was looking up at the sky, screaming at an airplane flying overhead. And I just couldn't, and tears streaming down her face. I couldn't believe what was making this girl have a meltdown in the middle of her backyard. And then I said, well, what is it? She said, it's the Beatles. And I said, okay, whatever could make that girl do that, that's what I want to do. So that was kind of like how I got started. And then, of course, in Vietnam, I heard Big Girls Don't Cry by Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, and that just knocked me out. So at a very early age, I had a couple pivotal experiences that drew me into rock and roll and to music at the very beginning.
Paul Collins is with me here on Revenge of the 80s Radio. His book is coming out, I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat. Also, we're going to talk a little bit later about his special archival creation, or collection, I should say, Another World, the best of the archives. A common theme in the book, though, Paul, is something reflected in your music. You worked extremely hard to become who you are, and you did it differently, taking a more independent route. You carved out and built your own place in music history with your own hammer and chisel, not even with the help of a jackhammer. I use hammer and chisel figuratively, and reading the book and listening to you talk all these years and hearing your music, this seems like the way it was.
Well, yeah, I guess once I got the bug, so to speak, and once I decided that this was what I really wanted to do, especially when I went out to California and I met up with Jack Lee and Peter Case and we had the Nerves, the brand of music that to us came so naturally and seemed so obvious was just a very, very tough road to hoe in terms of getting any kind of commercial success. And of course, in the beginning, it's, to think about those kind of things, you just do what you love to do, which is the way it should be. And then at a certain point, after a certain amount of time, you really are hoping that that can also translate into a way that you can, make your living. And so I guess, what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention. And because of the resistance from the status quo or the establishment, we were kind of forced to go on our own road, which is what we did.
I wonder how rock and roll history might have been different if the Nerves were on CPO Sharkey that last episode rather than the Dickies. But again, different music. Still,
one never knows.
things might have been different. Paul, it just seemed like the DI route became your way, your path. You did say in the book, Jack Lee, and you mentioned him just a moment ago, the co-founder of the Nerves with you, was an excellent mentor to you as well, with examples in the book. Without giving too much up, how did his advice and influence help you succeed in the music business with a genre you and the team basically invented?
Well, the thing that I think impressed me the most about Jack Lee was he had such an incredibly high criteria. He was only interested in achieving the absolute best possible, and he didn't fool himself, which is a very tricky thing when you write or create anything in the artistic world. It's easy to think that you've maybe done something better than, or that you think it's better than what it actually is. He was extremely critical, and that was one of the most important things I learned from him. He never took any of these artistic achievements for granted. He was so adamant about going over every inch of a song to make sure that there was nothing extraneous in there. And the living proof of that is on that first EP and songs like Hanging on the Telephone and all four of those songs on that record. There's not an ounce of fat on them. They've all been stripped down to the basic essence of what the idea was. And that was a great thing to learn at a young age.
Paul Collins is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio with the book I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat. We're talking about the book right now. We have more coming in just a little bit. The glaring point you made in the book, or one of the glaring points you make in the book, and one you made in our first conversation on Revenge of the 80s Radio, was you never really had formal training as a young musician or in early to mid-teens, yet you still wanted to be a rock star and you made it into Juilliard.
Yeah, that was kind of funny. I think there might be a lot of rock and roll musicians who share this with me. Is I loved the music and everything, but part of me was kind of lazy. I wanted the easy way. I just wanted to roll out of bed and be in a rock band and be a rock star, and I figured that should be fun. But as life sometimes teaches us, some of these things that you want to do at the outset seem easy, and then in order to really achieve them, they become more work than you ever expected. And that's kind of what happened with me. I didn't have any formal training, but I did get a certain type of training. And part of that training was listening to music every single night on my little transistor radio when I was going to sleep in Manhasset, Long Island, and years after that. That was my college. That was my rock and roll university. Just listening to all those songs and those melodies and how they put those songs together, which always fascinated me. I was just like, I couldn't, in the beginning it was like I didn't know how they did it. All I knew is that I really wanted to learn how.
Paul, what did you do to get better at the drums and eventually the strings?
Every performing artist will tell you the same thing. Practice, 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 practice. We used to practice, and that's that's the special thing when you start playing or start doing something, whether it be, playing guitar or drums or tennis or dancing or whatever it is that your particular discipline that you decide you want to do, is when you're young, you have that boundless time and energy to dedicate to your craft. And we would spend all day. That's all we did. all we did was think and play and think about music. So we would rehearse for hours and hours and hours. I think Peter once went on record saying is when we were sitting in Jack's little rundown flop house room on Pine and Gough, he said, I remember looking out the window and seeing the clock say 10 o'clock, and then I looked out again and it was 10 o'clock, but it was 10 o'clock at night. So, that's kind of the way it was. We really couldn't think of any better way to spend our time. And in that respect, we were extremely serious. We weren't hanging out. We weren't in bars, chatting up the girls or any of that stuff. We were playing music, and we loved it, and it was the only thing we could think of doing with our time. But we did put the time in, and I think that is a necessity or an essential ingredient in anybody's trajectory that manages to do something with what their decided craft is.
The book, I Don't Fit In, is a fun read, and it really gets into your life and everything else. And I don't want to give up too much, but when you read the book, our listeners are going to find a lot of interesting tidbits, including this one. You seriously had a downstairs neighbor who would blast Hitler's speeches on you?
I know. It's true. Somehow, this couple, and a lot of those early things are written really from memory, because obviously I didn't have any notes or anything. And your mind is as a natural, I guess, whatever you call it, computer that filters out the stuff that's important or the stuff that isn't so important. But the stuff that sticks out, you remember 20, 30, 40 years later. And yes, there was an old couple living downstairs from me. And there was several things I never forgot about them. This was back in, the mid 70s in New York, when New York was a whole different ball game. And some people lived in fear of their landlords. They were so afraid that they would get kicked out or whatever, because there wasn't that much protection back then. So these people had a toilet that had been broken for many, many years. And because initially I was kind of friends with them, and I'd go into their apartment, which was, kind of horrible. I said, well, why don't you just call the landlord? And they'd say, oh, no, you can't do that. Anyway, I had my drums set up, and I would practice my drums, which legitimately would drive anybody crazy. I understand. I didn't think so then, but I know that now. So they would blast. They somehow had in their possessions original, I guess they may even been 78s.
78
Adolf Hitler's speeches, and they would blast them. So I would hear, and this crowd screaming, and okay, I get it. I get the drift. So yes, that is true.
Paul Collins is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Straight ahead, we're going to talk a bit more about the book, I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat, and we're also going to discuss Another World, the Best of the Archives. All this on Revenge of the 80s Radio. The Nerves hanging on the telephone on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Jack Lee, Peter Case, and my guest, Paul Collins. We're talking about his new book, I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat, and his upcoming collection of archival music, Another World, the Best of the Archives. Paul, back to the book. You discussed the Nerves' formation and, of course, the beat. The Nerves were a different kind of rock band. Not only did you create what we call power pop, but there was less emphasis on the ever-popular guitar solo and more on the team ethic in the song. Was this by design, or did that sort of blend together as you, Case, and Lee evolved the group?
It was, I guess, both things. As people will see, which was kind of never really brought out in over the years, and this finally with the text and the ample photographs, because I was very lucky to hold on to tons of pictures. The band started actually as a four-piece with Jack's best friend Pat Stengel, who I didn't meet originally, but initially, but then when we started rehearsing, he was there. And we were your typical four-piece band with the guitar solos and everything. And at one point, we split ways. Pat didn't see things as we saw them, and just in a flash, and in 1 second, he was gone. And at that point, Jack really said, this is great. This is what we really want to do. We want to become more skeletal. We want to become more minimalist, and we did, and it just we had this. It was a very special setup between Peter's driving bass and my very basic, simple drums, a lot of eighth note bass drum patterns, and Jack's very unusual guitar chording patterns and chord positions, and the way we would approach. It wasn't so much of a solo as it was a musical break, and there was just something very special about that, and very full at the same time. Instead of being thinner, it became bigger, because there was this driving motor with the bass and drums, and then this just very unusual guitar floating in and out. So we never missed not having a solo. And of course, this is right on the cusp of the time where music and people were, the younger musicians were really reacting and rebelling, against that whole, musicianship and these big guitar solos. Virtuosity is the word I was looking for. Peter Frampton and all these 20-minute guitar solos and all that whole sound that was happening. We were diametrically opposed to that. We wanted something more visceral, we wanted to go straight for the throat, faster tempos and more direct music.
Another interesting part of your life with the Nerves, you guys did pretty well at the military clubs.
We had one we did a lot of clubs. For some reason, there was a guy at the Fort Mason's Officer Club. He was a sergeant, and for some reason, he really liked us. So he gave us. We had a residency at the Fort Mason's Officer Club, which was a very, very posh, club for the top officers in San Francisco. And so we played weddings and dinners and dances, and they just, because one of the key things is we had those three-piece suits, and we just looked like nice boys. So they gave us a lot of work. And of course, we loved it because we were starving to death, and we would, gorge ourselves on steak and lobster and all the food that, we could get our hands on at these buffets.
That's always extra incentive. And I always tell people, wear a suit because it makes you look so much better.
That's what Slim Whitman said, too.
Hey, Slim's the man. He always looked good in his suits, didn't he?
You know what his word was? It always impressed me. He said, I want to be known as a guy who always had a smile on his face and a clean suit.
Excellent. That is genius. Wise words from Slim Whitman. In the book, you also alluded to the Breakaways, Paul. We talked about them a while back, too. While short-lived, how important was that part of your musical life, which would see you forming the Beat shortly after?
Well, when the Nerves fell apart, it was understandably for me, it was devastating. I really, in my mind, I just could see no reason why that band wasn't going to be. Well, that's the way we believed back then. I thought, we were going to be as big as the Beatles. I just thought with these fantastic songs, there was just no way that the world at large was going to, ignore that. But things turned out differently, and after the tour, which was pretty much the apex, we had done everything humanly possible that a band without any infrastructure or support could have done. We put out a record, we did a national tour, and we still couldn't get anywhere. And then, of course, Hollywood is probably always been a very tough place, and it was a tough place then to be, especially when nothing was going your way. So we were just back in Hollywood and basically back on the street. And so when the Nerves fell apart, it was like, what are we going to do? For me, the idea of going back into nothingness was just too depressing and too overwhelming. So I desperately wanted to, at least hold on to my relationship with Peter, because both of these guys I looked up to tremendously as musicians and writers, et cetera, et cetera. So Peter and I maintained, and the Breakaways was kind of like that was kind of the way we thought about things, that everything had to be very logical and make sense and clean, and so the Breakaways was pop, but it also captured the essence of what was happening. The Nerves had fallen apart and we were breaking away. And it's funny about that band because it was very short-lived, and another example of how difficult it was back then. There was still no interest in this kind of music. The resistance was just tremendous. And so the band basically got a record deal 30 years later when Alive Records put out the Breakaways record. So good things come to those who wait. But it was instrumental in the sense that, you can't give up. So that was a way to not give up and stay in the game. And then, of course, at a certain point when we couldn't get anywhere, lack of, it's like, a plant or a flower. You don't give it any water and it's eventually going to die. And then Peter, needed to go off and do his own thing, which I understood. I wasn't happy about it, but I understood. So he was a basic part of the beat in the very, very beginning when I met Steve and stuff. But that didn't last long. And fortunately, Stephen replaced both Jack Lee and Peter Case for me because I wasn't secure enough to do something on my own at that point, and I wouldn't be for many years later. So Steve was really a great working partner with me for many, many years to come. More years, actually, than all that stuff. But the Nerves was so pivotal for me. It was very instrumental in me going from really nothing and just floating around saying I want to be in a rock and roll band to actually doing it and learning the ropes.
We're talking about Paul Collins' new book, I Don't Fit In. You wrote about meeting Benny Goodman as something that stuck with you for the rest of your life in the book, Paul.
Well, yeah, that was kind of a big deal. We were making the first album with Bruce, and it was a very serious working situation. We were working at United Western, which was a no-frills, very professional studio in Hollywood where bands like the Beach Boys had recorded, but it was real. It was, at that time we were in the height of studio excess and, the studios that had hot tubs and this, that, and the other thing. I'll let you use your imagination as to what. And this was not anything like that. This was a place to record, and that was it. And we responded in kind. We were there. We were all business. We did exactly what our producer asked us to do. There was no monkey business. There was no fooling around. And one day he just said, "Hey, you guys want to meet Benny Goodman? He's down the hall. They're rehearsing for his show at the Hollywood, at the Jazz Bowl, at the Hollywood Bowl." And we said, "Of course." So he takes us down there, and Benny's on a break with his band, and they introduce us to him. And what impressed me so much is, obviously, without even knowing a lot of his music, everybody knew who he was. This is Benny Goodman, one of the jazz music giants of American music. And he stopped what he was doing. He came over, and what impressed me most about him is, and then bear in mind, he's 60, 70 years old, and we are in our early 20s. And he shook my hand. He looked me right in the eye. He smiled, and he said, "Hey, young man, how are you? Good luck with your record." And what impressed me about that is, obviously, he must have had a million things going on and a million things in his mind, but he stopped everything to be very much in the present with me. And that's something that has taken me a long time to get back to. Because, you get along with your own life and your own things, and you're always moving 50 miles an hour, and you don't necessarily stop and be in the present with yourself or with the people that you're interacting with. So it was really much later that I realized how important what he did and what Roy Rogers did with me, that those lessons, I learned them, but it took me a while to get to learn them.
Paul Collins is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. You'll read more about Paul's encounters with other legends in the book, I Don't Fit In. He does talk about the Beat and beyond. The Beat did see a lot of success and wound up on the Caddyshack soundtrack, in essence, band built with the DIY values like the Beat on a blockbuster movie. This is big, and it opened you up to a lot of new fans, people who had not been privy to the Nerves or the Breakaways or power pop too much at all.
Yes, there's no doubt about the fact that the Beat got the Golden Glove treatment. I mean, we were signed to CBS Records, Columbia Records, and we were managed by Bill Graham, which instantly, put us from being on the street into the big leagues, and really very big leagues, bigger leagues than we understood that we were in. We were in the big pool with the Sharks. And that had its pros and cons. And unfortunately, I think there was an expectation for us to do something that was there's just a lot of politics involved in that whole situation, and we were just kids. So, what happened is what happened. What happened to a lot of people that got into that situation. Some fared better than others.
Read more about that in the book I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat. Chris Cordani here with Paul Collins. Straight ahead, we're going to talk about Another World, the Best of the Archives. Go, from 2018 by Paul Collins. From the album Out of My Head, Paul is with me now. We just talked about the book I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerve and the Beat. Let's talk about another creation he's offering, or sort of a collection. Another World, the Best of the Archives. These demos, outtakes, and other archival finds are now available on this new collection. What inspired you to make them public?
I'm very excited, and it's just a bit of a coincidence that both the book and the archival record are coming out at the same time, because both of them were quite long in the making, so to speak. The archival record is it's the best of my personal cassette collection, 40-year collection that I've been dragging around the world with me since 1975, and I finally managed to archive it all by digitizing it and putting it onto my computer. And when I was done, I just culled the best songs, performances. A majority of the songs have never been released. Some of them have, but not in this. These are to me, the best performances of those songs, or there's something special about them that warrant them being on this collection. So you will hear like one of the earliest recordings of Let Me Into Your Life with me and Peter Case and two or three other guys in my living room in Los Angeles, who I don't even remember who these guys were, to song demos of me playing the acoustic guitar of a long lost song that I had completely forgotten about. But all the special recordings that for one reason or other qualify as having that magic that millions of musicians got using their little realistic tape recorders or whatever kind of cassette recorders they had, trying to perfect their craft. And so I'm extremely excited by this record. I really think it just gives you that wonderful special insight, and there's some fantastic songs on it. Songs that I know if I went into the studio now, they wouldn't come out this way. They wouldn't have that special spark to them. So I'm very happy that my fans and anybody in general will be able to hear these songs and get the same kind of goosebump feeling that I get when I listen to them.
Paul, I want to get back to the fact that these tracks were on cassette. How did those things keep all these years? He must have had them in shoeboxes. It's amazing that. What really made this project happen was that Risho cassette player, which they began advertising 2 or 3 years ago. The first time I saw it, I go, okay, that's what I need to get, because it basically took your tape and you plugged it right into your computer through a USB thing, and it just digitized it. And there was an audiophile platform with it that really almost gave you a recording studio on your computer. You could control the sample rate that you recorded it at, so you were really able to get high quality copies. And when you hear this record, partially because of the way I was able to record it, and partially because of the man who mastered it, Justin Perkins, up in Milwaukee, who is getting more accolades by the minute for his work as a mastering technician. It doesn't sound like cassettes. It doesn't have all that hiss and all that breakup and all that stuff. It really sounds great. And when I listen to it, I'm just blown away by how good it sounds. So I'm just very happy about the way it came out. Honestly, I have boxes of old radio shows and demos of mine on cassette, some of the classic interviews from many years ago, too. I never had the heart to throw them out, but I do remember some of them over the years getting tangled up and having to rewind them with a pencil.
Oh, I did all that. In fact, you know what I did? I had some cassettes, and I'm talking 40 years old, and I knew they would only make one play, so I didn't even pre-listen to them. I just carefully rewound them, some of them by hand, because sometimes you know how fast they get going. The tape would just snap when it got to the end because they were so old. So I would carefully rewind them. I would record them on the first time through. I would make sure I had all the levels right. And then in some cases, I would have to break the cassette box. So I would keep some good cassette, you know how some of them you have to break apart. Some of them actually have screws so you could unscrew them.
I've been
And
there.
put the reel of tape into a better cassette housing and carefully thread it through. And sometimes I even had to use my Elmer's glue stick and splice it and glue it onto the reel. And I would do anything I could to not lose that tape.
That's right. These kids from today will know nothing of the grease pen and the razor blade.
Right.
That's right. I still have some of that old equipment too. The reel-to-reels,
Oh,
razor
that
blade,
little
the
metal
tape.
block with
Yep.
the slant on it, so you could edit the tapes. Yeah, I mean that stuff is great.
Paul, in your liner notes, you described the fun you had remixing and listening to your old tapes. I imagine it was impossible, or virtually impossible, since you actually did it, to narrow it down to a relative few. So let's talk about a few of the songs you included. You recorded a couple with your brother Patrick, including the title track Another World. You described that in the liner notes as the crown jewel of the album.
It is, and it's quite possibly the crown jewel of my entire writing output. It's a song that, to me, is just really captures the whole ball of wax about power pop and about the lyrics and the music, and that performance with Steve Huff playing bass and the program drums that he put together, and my brother playing guitar. I've recorded that song professionally. I recorded it in San Francisco in 24 tracks with I believe, oh God, the guy from Earthquake. Oh, his name is escaping me. I can see his face. Robbie Dunbar. And I forget whether it's Chris Isaac's rhythm section, Kenny Dale Johnson and Rowley playing bass and drums on it. But, the top guys from that whole field in San Francisco on that album. But it doesn't have that magic. And for years I was like, oh man, if we could just get this demo out, because the demo was always like the bar. And then when I put this whole thing, because I have many recordings of that song, that one was buried deep on one of these tapes. And when I played it, my girlfriend started crying, because it just had that. It was just so special. My ex-wife is singing background vocals on it with Steve and Patrick, and it just transcended quality in terms of the recording quality. It just has that special magic feel.
So that being the crown jewel, Another World, on the other end of the spectrum, you, in your liner notes, said, "Hey DJ," which we've heard on a later album, and "On the Highway" were total crap at the time.
Yeah, it's funny. Well, that's what time and perspective will give you. Those songs were done. They were for part of the second album recording, and the second album was probably The Kids Are the Same. Was probably the most difficult album I ever made. We were about to get dropped from the label. There was very little interest in the band. They had fired Bruce Botnick, which was a tremendous mistake. We had fired Michael Ruiz, which was another tremendous mistake, our drummer. And we had been in a year-long tailspin. We were in LA consuming drugs, writing crappy songs, trying to get this album done. We started it and scrapped it 3 times in a row. And those 2 songs were part of the second attempt. And we went, when we finished recording them, they're with Prairie Prince on drums, who's a great drummer from the Tubes. Love Prairie. And we went to New York to mix them down at Sterling Sound, which is a big-time recording studio. And somebody had the good sense to say, hey, can we record these while you're, doing it? They weren't even mixing them. They were just doing a playback. And what had happened was we had brought in 2 musicians from Bruce Springsteen's band that the producer at the time, John Jensen, knew, to try to get the big rock sound, because at that point, 1981, I guess it was, everything had to have the big rock sound. You know, you had to sound like Tom Petty and U2 and all this stuff, which those are great bands and all that stuff, but that's not what we were doing. So they put keyboards on the highway, and they put sax on Hey DJ. At the time, we were like, doesn't really float our boat. Years later, listening to it, and I loved the organ on Highway, and I loved Prairie's drumming, which is slightly simpler than and Dennis's. The album versions are great, but these have something special to them too, and I love the sax at the end where it goes, blah. So I said, hey, let's do it.
All you needed was a tuba to add to that, but the sax is always great.
Right.
Paul Collins is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. We talked about his book, I Don't Fit In. We're now talking about his collection of archived music, Another World. A couple other tracks before we finish up the interview. Baby I'm a Fool offers a different side to Paul Collins.
Yes, and I love that song, albeit it's not power pop. It's a little more bluesy. But, when you write songs for 20, 30, 40 years, you're not always going to write the same kind of song. I know people would be happy if I just wrote Rock and Roll Girl over and over again, but obviously I couldn't do that even if I wanted to. So this was an outtake for not an outtake. I did an ill-fated recording in Barcelona that's, I guess every artist needs at least one bootleg record, and that was mine. It's come out. They say it was recorded in New York, which is a total fabrication. It was recorded in Barcelona, and this was a 2-track studio recording that I made. I just kind of did a vocal guitar recording of all the songs slated for that record, and this was on that tape. And I always loved that sound that we got. And it's kind of funny. When I transcribed these tapes, in the beginning, when I transcribed them, I just threw them out because I was in such a rush to get this stuff out of my house and make room. And I made a big mistake. Fortunately, when I realized that I was going to make a record out of this, I started saving the really good keeper songs, the actual cassettes, in case I wanted to send them to a better studio to transcribe them, which I didn't do in the end. But that particular song is the one that has the most, let's say, background noise on it. It's not really that bad, but of all of them, that's the worst offender. But it's such a great performance that it works.
Paul, sometimes an artist gets to hear a long-forgotten track from the perspective of a more seasoned performer and songwriter decades later. You have had this experience with some of the music on the album, including, and according to your liner notes, it's true because it's there, No Faith and No Religion.
Yes. That song, I always remembered it in the back of my head, but when I actually heard it again, and that's just me sitting at my apartment on 1820 North La Brea in Hollywood, and it's really almost a sketch, and it's on a tape of sketches, because that's what we did. We sat around all day. Oh, this is good. Let's record it. And sometimes I have tapes of me playing the same song over 20 times. And unfortunately, sometimes the song isn't that good. So it's like, oh my God, another version. But this one really has a very special thing about it. The words and the music, and it just kind of sums up how I must have been feeling then, which was kind of lost in Hollywood.
Paul, once again, the book is I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat, and the new album, Another World, The Best of the Archives. What would you like listeners and readers of both of these to learn most about you through them?
Just that, I'm one more guy who loves playing music and has had enough success to stay in the game, and I feel fortunate that I get to still do this. I still have a lot of challenges and things in front of me and desires. I mean, I still want to have a top 10 hit record, and there's a lot of things I still want to achieve. Still want to be a rock star, and the other thing is that I don't know if this is a takeaway or not, but these two, the record and the book, make a very nice bow tie. They're both taking place or coming about during this pandemic, which as we all know, is a life-changing event or a major life event for most everybody alive on the planet. So we're all unified in this one experience. And for me, this is kind of a bow tie. It's almost like the end of a chapter. What that chapter is, I'm not quite sure yet, but it really does feel like a bow tie to my next step, which I'm not sure what it'll be yet. But I really feel like this is the time for me to transition into something, still with music, of course, and art and all that. But so I'm happy they're both coming out together. And just, that I really love music. And I hope you do too.
Paul Collins, thank you again for being with us on Revenge of the 80s Radio.
My pleasure, as always, Chris.
Again, the book is I Don't Fit In, My Wild Ride Through the Punk and Power Pop Trenches with the Nerves and the Beat, and the album, Another World, The Best of the Archives. Links to both you can find on our website, revengeofthe80sradio.com. Let's play a track included on a 7-inch record that comes with the book I Don't Fit In, a demo of a 24-track studio recording of the classic, There She Goes, from the Beat on Revenge of the 80s Radio.